Well, welcome to the Community Forum for Philosophy and Religion. We're excited to have the speakers series on Jainist philosophy. The Community Forum is a consortium of area community colleges, including Victor Valley College, Cerritos College, Barstow College, and Riverside. So we kind of band together to try to promote some talks, and we're really excited today for our talk with Dr. Mundra. And I'll turn it over to Professor Chapman to introduce him.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Let me make sure we have your pronunciation correct. It's Mundra or Mundra?
Mundra, yeah.
Mundra?
Mundra, yeah. Anil.
Okay. So I just want to introduce him really quick. Dr. Anil Mundra, he did his PhD at the University of Chicago. He is the Bhagwan Vilmnath Endowed Chair in Jain Studies and South Asian Religions at UC Santa Barbara. And we were looking for people to speak this term on philosophy in Jainism, and we're very happy to have him here. Thank you, Dr. Mundra. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much for having me here. Great to see such a great turnout. I'm sorry, I'm a little out of breath because I just run from my first lecture of the spring quarter here at UCSB, and I'm new here, so I'm still finding my way around campus a little bit. But I'm going to share my slides here. Can you see that? And now I'm going to put it in. Can you see that in full screen now? My title slide. Okay.
Yes, we see. Yep.
So, as Professor Chapman said, I work on this small South Asian, Indian subcontinental religion of Jainism, and I am going to talk about Jainism, but I'm going to set it in the context, in a sort of a broader context of South Asia, South Asian philosophy and philosophical debates between the various South Asian religions. So philosophical and religious diversity seems to have been a fact of life in South Asia for pretty much all of recorded history. And some of the oldest accounts that we have of engagement with the varieties of belief, practice, and identitarian affiliation, right? Religious identities. Some of the oldest accounts that we have of these kinds of engagements are found in these Jain texts. Now, as far as we can tell, the Jains have pretty much always been a minority, although in places they've been an influential one. They've commanded a lot of attention and resources sometimes, and the ear and patronage of power, right? The powers that be. But maybe partly because of their generally sort of marginal status, they seem to have always been especially attuned to the differences and disagreements around them. So this shows up in their early Jain scriptures, often in the form of dialogues between like a Jain teacher and an adherent of some other path. And these dialogues generally end up in the conversion of the opponent, right? The conversion of the adherent of the other path to Jainism, and so the vindication of the Jain teaching, right? So these are clearly dialogues that are written by and for Jains, and they sort of imagine other people, but these early texts seem to be pretty well sort of insulated within a Jain bubble, and they're not obviously party to an ongoing conversation in which religious claims and counterclaims are being made dialogically across thinkers affiliated with different religious doctrines, right? And there doesn't seem to be such a sort of an overt dialogue or conversation between different religions in this early period. But the turning point here comes with the formalization of logic that is crystallized in the so-called Nyaya Sutras of a philosopher called Akshapada Gautama. And this system of logic builds on actually systems of public medical debate that are already articulated in the foundational Ayurveda text, which is called the Charaka Samhita. So maybe some of you have heard of Ayurveda, ancient Indian medicine. And in these Ayurvedic texts, they actually talk about how you can debate about medical treatment. And so these logic texts of the Nyaya Sutra builds on these systems of debate. And then the real tipping point is the Buddhist philosopher named Dignaga. And Dignaga appropriates and applies logic to debates between the various philosophical schools that are flourishing and burgeoning in this period, which is about the 6th century of the Common Era, so about 1500 years ago, roughly. Dignaga's framework for argumentation allowed thinkers of various affiliations to formulate their systems and respond to each other. And then this ushers in what's often been called a sort of golden age of Indian philosophy. Now, much of this Buddhist philosopher Dignaga's writing is nowadays exists only in Tibetan translation of the Sanskrit text. But we have his rules for argumentation in Sanskrit largely because they were preserved in a commentary by a Jain monk named Haribhadrasūri. And Haribhadrasūri dives right into the middle of this milieu, this milieu of interreligious debate. So here's a statue of him in a temple devoted to him in the northwestern Indian state of Rajasthan. Can you all see this statue? I just want to make sure my slides are advancing properly. Yeah, okay. So I'm going to focus on Haribhadra. Because he's a transformative figure. He's credited with a whole wide range of works, narrative stories, and unusual satire, catalogs of various doctrines that I'm going to be talking about shortly, texts on yoga, texts on proper monastic conduct, proper lay conduct, non-monastic conduct, and also various independent philosophical essays. So I want to start by looking at how Haribhadra picks up and elaborates this Buddhist logic, the Buddhist Dignaga's system of argumentation in his commentary I mentioned on this Buddhist text called The Introduction to Logic, Nyaya Pravesha in Sanskrit, the Introduction to Logic. So as I mentioned, this is a system of rules for reasoning and argumentation that sort of enshrined a common language for debate among thinkers that had different commitments, that that didn't agree on big things. So a key concept in this system, which Haribhadra emphasizes, is the notion of what is accepted in common between a pair of debaters. So here's how Haribhadra explains this notion. I have it up on the slide here. Accepted in common means established without controversy between proponent and an opponent. That is, between the proponent of some motion, of some. Okay, I'm sorry. I was trying to make my window smaller, but that's not. Okay, so accepted in common means established without controversy between the proponent of some idea, some proposition, some claim, and the opponent, the audience who is listening to them and is trying to respond to them. So this term denotes agreement between the two parties to a debate. Now, the point is not, of course, for these two parties, these two debaters, to agree on everything. Indeed, I mean, one of the basic rules in this system, which seems kind of obvious, is that they shouldn't already agree about the very question that's at issue in the debate, right? Because otherwise, there would be no point in having the debate in the first place. However, at the same time, they need to agree, and this is kind of the interesting part, right? They need to agree on some basic terms in order for the debate to get off the ground. So the proponent wants to, the proponent of the proposition on the table wants to prove that something is some way, right? So to put it in logical terms, that some subject possesses some predicate. Some subject S is predicate P. But if the two debaters don't even agree that this subject exists, if one of them doesn't think that it's a thing at all, strike through subject S, then they don't accept it in common. And that's a problem, right? It would be arguing, the Indian philosophers say it would be like arguing about the teeth of a crow. This is a stock Sanskrit phrase to signify there's no there there. There's nothing to argue about because crows have no teeth, right? So why argue about the teeth of a crow? Because there are no teeth of a crow. So, excuse me. So, for example, to make this concrete, the introduction to logic gives the illustration, a concrete illustration of when a Hindu yogi says the self, or we could say the soul, is conscious. When they say this to a Buddhist, okay? Now, what is wrong with this picture? Why do you think this violates this basic rule of debate that I've told you? Does anyone? I'm interested to see if anyone can pick up on the issue here. So, anyone want to pipe up and tell me what is wrong with what rule of like how this violates the basic rules of debate that I've mentioned? I don't know if you all have you all have studied Buddhism a little bit in your class already? Or
There's some responses in the chat.
oh, okay, great. Sorry, let me look at the chat. Yes, so so a number of people have said it assumes the self that is existent, but Buddhists don't think there is an ultimate self. So you have to first establish the self, the Atman. The Atman is the Sanskrit word for the self. That's exactly correct. That's the problem. So someone now, if you didn't know this, if you had never studied Buddhism before, someone who didn't know any Indian philosophy or Buddhism in particular, might have no idea what the problem is, right? And the introduction to logic, this text doesn't tell us what the problem is. It's up to Haribhadra's commentary on this root text, this Jain Haribhadra's commentary on this Buddhist primer of logic, to tell us. Haribhadra tells us, reminds us, as some of you have reminded us, that Buddhists think that there is no self, right? So this is the central Buddhist tenet of selflessness that several of you mentioned, on account of which this subject of debate here is not accepted in common by both parties to this debate, right? It's not accepted by the Buddhist opponent, who is to respond to the proposition that the Hindu yogi has put on the table, that the self is conscious. So that's where the debate has gone wrong, according to this rule of logic. Now, note that these school names, these identifications, right? These school identities or religious identities are crucial to understanding what's going on here, because this proposition, the mere proposition, the self is conscious, is not taken on its own by itself self-contradictory or equivocal, right? Anybody could say the self is conscious, and that seems like a perfectly good proposition. But it only becomes problematic or even self-contradictory by conflicting with other doctrines that are assumed to be held by one of the parties of the debate in virtue of their school affiliation, in virtue of their identity, their identitarian affiliation. So that is to say, a certain sort of identitarian frame, we could say, is constitutive of the rules of debate. You have to know who is at the table, what their doctrinal commitments are, and you need to literally come to terms with them to establish a sort of a background of shared terms in order to be able to understand and grapple with your differences. You need to find, to put it in sort of a slogan, you need to find some common ground in order for the debate to get off the ground. That is to say, disagreement requires a background of substantial agreement, some sort of shared presuppositions between parties in intellectual conflict. Excuse me. Okay, so Dignaga, the Buddhist Dignaga, and his Jain commentator, Haribhadra, have shown us how the navigation of doctrinal difference presupposes some commonality. But having come this far, we sort of seem to be at an impasse, right? Because the problem is, what if even sort of a minimal background of agreement, such minimal background of agreement, shared terms, is not forthcoming? How do you adjudicate disagreements about sort of the most basic tenets, the most foundational premises about the nature of the world? Things like the existence of the self, right? That's a really, really basic issue. Do souls exist or not? How do you navigate and how do you adjudicate those sorts of disagreements? According to the system of logic, that sort of basic disagreement can just short circuit the whole kind of debate. So how do we deal with that? And this is, I think, where Haribhadra brings in the Jain theory of anekāntavāda. Which we could translate as the theory of many-sidedness. That's how I put it in my title, or I actually prefer to translate it as non-one-sidedness. I think non-one-sidedness was a little too wonky for the title of the talk, but it is a more literal and I think a more descriptive translation. So that's actually what I'm going to call it from now on. So this theory of non-one-sidedness, anekāntavāda, has been called the central philosophy of Jainism. It is indeed a really central pillar of Jainism, and these days it's often positioned alongside cardinal Jain doctrines of nonviolence, ahimsa, which I understand you have been talking about in some of your classes. And there's another really important Jain doctrine called aparigraha, that means non-acquisitiveness, basically not being greedy. And these two, ahimsa, nonviolence, and aparigraha, non-acquisitiveness, are often positioned alongside anekāntavāda as sort of the three sort of pillars of the Jain faith. So anekāntavāda is really important, and Haribhadra's treatment strips this theory of non-one-sidedness down to its barest bones, which is a logical, or you could say ontological, metaphysical doctrine that I like to call the compossibility of contraries. Namely, what is the compossibility of contraries? It is that any real thing admits equally of contrary predicates. So, to take the most metaphysically, ontologically fundamental example, any real thing is both existent and non-existent. Now, you may be surprised to learn that the argumentative engine here of Haribhadra's theory of non-one-sidedness is, again, the notion of what is accepted in common. He says that this is commonly accepted without a doubt. And this is the same important notion that we saw in the introduction to logic, that you need to have certain terms or certain ideas accepted in common. And this, by the way, has escaped the notice of pretty much all modern readers of non-one-sidedness. And that's, excuse me, that's not surprising, because the basic thesis, right, is on the face of it pretty hard to accept. I mean, how is this possible, right? How can this be, how can something both exist and not exist? This can't be commonly accepted. This is obviously a doctrine that flirts with paradox. In fact, a lot of people have seen it as sort of outrightly contradictory, embracing contradictions. So this presumably can't be commonly accepted, and it was not, in fact, commonly accepted, apparently, by Haribhadra's opponents, most of Haribhadra's opponents at least. Many of them ridiculed the Jains for, what they regarded as sort of a totally incoherent theory. But Haribhadra positions this doctrine of compossibility of contraries as an item of utterly obvious common sense. It is commonly accepted without a doubt. How can he do that? How can this be a commonsensical thing, that any real thing admits of contrary predicates, any real thing is both existent and non-existent? Well, the basic idea is that any real thing is existent as itself and is not existent as something else. That anything is as it is and is not as it isn't. So to elaborate this according to Jain analytical categories, Haribhadra says that anything is both existent and non-existent because it's existent in the form of its own substance, place, time, and state. That is, I am here now in, I'm a sort of a human substance in my current state of dress and in my hair shaved off, right? And it's not existent in the form of another substance, place, time, and state. I am not in some other place, in some other time, in some other state, in some other form, some other substance. So Haribhadra's arguments purport to show that even people who claim to dispute his thesis, in fact, necessarily presuppose it, either in the sort of their own words of their own arguments, or in the everyday actions that everyone has to perform. So for example, someone who wants to carry water with a pot will have to understand that pot's identity as a pot and not as a cloth. So the pot exists as a pot, and it does not exist as a cloth. It's the pot that it is and is not what it isn't, right? And if you try to carry water with a cloth, you'll soon find yourself not carrying water, and meanwhile, you'll become very wet. So that is, on Haribhadra's view, this complexity or non-one-sidedness of reality is presupposed by all of us, even by the overeducated philosopher who tries to sort of reduce it to extreme one-sided views, saying everything really is existent or everything is really non-existent. And we'll see some examples of philosophers that might say things like that. Okay, now the question is, who cares, right? If this is all there is to non-one-sidedness, if it's really so obvious and commonsensical that anything is as it is and is not as it's not, it seems pretty straightforward, even almost trivial. Why does it matter? Well, it's stakes, although this basic idea is, at least in Haribhadra's view, and I think maybe we can accept this, is that it is quite obvious, but its stakes are not obvious and are not trivial. Its consequences, its ramifications, it ramifies in a certain understanding of the identity of objects and the determinacy of language about them. And this is an understanding that Haribhadra's opponents repudiate, actually. So not many of Haribhadra's opponents, Buddhists or Hindu opponents, will easily accept that things are determined by contraries. They want to usually say that identities are unitary, that what it is to be something is to have a singular nature, and something not existing as what it is not is simply another way of saying that it is what it is. So what's really true is that things are what they are. And if you say that something is not what it's not, that that is nothing. You're not saying anything more than just saying it is what it is. So these opponents will generally think that saying what something is not doesn't add anything to saying what it is. And you don't need to say what it's not. You really just need to say what it is. Whereas the philosopher on non-one-sidedness, on the other hand, stakes the claim that to fully identify something as the thing that it is requires situating its identity with respect to various contexts and distinguishing it from other things, the things that it's not. So just to say that something is, that something simply exists, is to say nothing at all. Okay, well, now why does all of this matter? So in South Asian philosophy, a most important question, a most pressing question, is one that we have already kind of touched on already, the question of personal identity, what a person really is. So in Sanskritic, South Asian philosophical context, this is usually phrased as the problem of the nature of the self, the Atman that we've talked about already. This has already made an appearance in the Introduction to Logic. And as we saw there are philosophers that we would now consider Hindu philosophers that tend to essentialize the self. They often identify oneself with one's consciousness, which, by the way, is not unlike some early modern Western philosophers. One might think of John Locke or someone like that. The Jain philosophical tradition agrees that consciousness is an essential characteristic of the soul. However, as we'll see in a second, this isn't all there is to say for Jains. So the philosophy of non-one-sidedness demands a rather more complex analysis of the self than simply saying it is conscious, it's consciousness. And on the other hand, Buddhists despair of any such analysis at all. So their view is pretty slippery, but they basically resist the whole project of self-identification, of trying to say what the self is. Now, these disagreements between between like Hindus and Buddhists, right? Hindus who say that the self is essentially conscious, and Buddhists who say, there is no essential self that you can grab onto and identify in that kind of way. These disagreements are pretty entrenched, as you can see. They're pretty polarized, right? And yet, however, there's arguably some common ground between them all. So what I have in mind is that one of the standard criteria of personal identity is the presupposition, this is shared amongst basically all Indian philosophers, the presupposition that anything deserving to be called one's true identity must be in some way persisting, must have some permanency. Okay, this is a typical typical Hindu way of characterizing one's true self and differentiating it from everything else that only appears to be oneself but can't really be oneself. That one's true self has to be permanent in some ways, because something flitting in and out of existence can hardly be said to count as oneself, right? That seems to be the guiding intuition. However, according to scholastic Buddhist metaphysics, everything is momentary. Everything flits in and out of existence. Everything is in constant flux from moment to moment. And there is no possibility of fixing on anything with a sort of stable nature of its own, including any self that you think you are. So this is another way of understanding this polarization between sort of Hindu and Buddhist philosophers, right? And this brings us back to the Jain theory of non-one-sidedness. So here's how the Jains intervene in this debate about the permanence of the self. They say that both Hindus and Buddhists are kind of right, and they're both kind of wrong. That is, in fact, anything is both permanent and impermanent. Oh, sorry, this slide is I was late to pull up this slide. So this slide is reiterating what I just said about these basic ideas of personal identity in South Asia, the nature of the self, and the polarization between Hindus and Buddhists, but they have this common presupposition that anything that deserves to be called the self has some permanency. And Jain theory of non-one-sidedness wants to say, actually, they're both kind of right and they're both kind of wrong. Anything is both permanent and impermanent. So Jains classically define any real thing, a real entity, as something that is subject to origination, persistence, and destruction. So they allow for both the stability of Hindu philosophers, something persisting, right, over time, and also the momentariness of Buddhists, something originating and passing away, coming into being and being destroyed. Indeed, Jains say that it's just this conjunction of contraries like permanence and impermanence that actually singles out anything as the particular thing that it is, persisting in its identity through its various states of empirical change. So they say that, in fact, neither a thing's permanence nor its change, its impermanence, is intelligible without the other. You can't understand a thing's being permanent without understanding its impermanence, and you can't understand a thing's changing, its impermanence, without understanding its persistence, its permanence. To identify something as changing, we need to identify some persisting, continuing thing that's undergoing that change, right? But to recognize it as something that is persisting, we need to interact with it, we need to experience it, and this would require some change on its part such that it can interact with us and affect us. That's briefly the idea here about why anything has to be understood as both changing and persisting. Something that's one-sidedly permanent, right, unchanging, would be inert, and it would be unable to interact with the causal order of existence. It would be bland, flat, colorless, invisible, nothing. So for something to be something, it has to be both persistent and variable, changing. Okay, now, I hope you all are still with me. This has all been a little abstract. And some people may, in fact, worry that these sort of contemplations of identity are kind of hopelessly vague and hand-waving. That's why I've been doing all this hand-waving. Some people might even wonder whether you can have any sort of rigorous concept of identity across the various contexts in which we use the term identity, and that sort of does all of this, captures all of this change and persistence and all these different ideas. Part of the problem is that there are at least two basic senses of the term identity as it's generally used in English. So most contemporary metaphysicians, philosophers of metaphysics, prioritize what they call a thing's numerical identity or self-sameness. That is a thing simply being itself. And they generally prioritize that over what is, the more colloquial sense in which we use identity that classifies an individual in a group with others of its own kind on the basis of some quality, so that we say an individual can have an identity or even have various identities. I have the identity of a professor, and I also have the identity of a father. I'm a father and a professor. These in Western philosophy we might these we can call these qualitative identities, these group classifications, and we can sort of, in Western philosophy, we can sort of trace this disjunction between what we can call numerical identity and qualitative identity back to, I think, Aristotle and his metaphysics, that in Aristotle's metaphysics seems to sort of subordinate qualities to the independent substance that possesses them. Aristotle says what is basically real in a primary sense is substance, and qualities, the qualities that a substance possesses, are real only in a sort of a secondary sense. Now, Jain philosophers resist this presumption, resist this metaphysical prioritization of substance to quality. So first of all, we can distinguish here two senses of the word substance, which so in both Sanskrit, there's a term dravya in Sanskrit, which translates the word, which I'm translating as the word substance. And in both Sanskrit and English, this term substance can be understood in two distinct but related ways. So first of all, temporally or diachronically, as what subsists or persists over time amidst change. And then secondly, synchronically, at any given time, substance is the substrate of qualities at any given moment. A substance is what qualities, are in, what qualities pertain to, what qualities subsist in. So note first that each of these senses of substance, respectively, points to each of the senses of identity that we've just scouted, right? So to say that a substance is what persists diachronically is to pick out its numerical identity, while to say that it's the substrate of qualities is to pick out its qualitative identity. And Jain philosophy generally seems to countenance each of these senses of substance equally, positioning them as being of a piece, having equal reality. Maybe they're even mutually implicative or inextricable. And that's not crazy, of course. I mean, it seems pretty intuitive to me, in as much as sort of one way, maybe even the chief way for something to persist over time is for it to be the self-identical substrate of changing qualities, right? As I was just saying, how do we identify something as persisting over time? Because we see that it is the single thing whose qualities are changing, and vice versa. To be the substrate of qualities arguably just is to be what remains the same if any of the qualities are changed over time, right? So it's intuitive to think that these two senses of substance are interrelated, but Jains actually seem to push a bit further than most philosophers in giving equal emphasis not only to both of these senses of substance, but also to these two senses of identity, and even further, giving equal ontological status to both substance and qualities. Not all philosophers do that. So as I've already said, arguably Aristotle does not do that. He says substances are what's really real, qualities are sort of only secondarily real insofar as they are in substances. And Haribhadra, for his part, tells us that Jains, unlike some of their opponents, he says Jains Jains do not regard substance and quality as being entirely different, as the Vaisheshikas do. That's one of their opponents. But we Jains say that rather that they are different in some way. Substance and quality are different in some way. They're not entirely different, but they're different in some way, because substance is not partless, but rather has a single cum multiple nature. So Jains really insist on the mutual imbrication of substance and quality, because they say that substance is both single and multiple. And this is, of course, another application of one-sidedness. A single substance without multiple qualities is invisible, unintelligible, it's nothing. While these multiple qualities without this, attaching to and hearing in a single substance are unmoored, they're unmanifest, they're nowhere. You can't have qualities just floating freely without substance, right? Okay. Now, I don't have time to fully flesh this out, but let me just briefly give you the outlines of an argument for this point, for how the philosophy of non-one-sidedness can make sense of a connection between what I've called numerical and qualitative identity, right? The identity of just something persisting through time and something having certain qualities. So recall that the most basic and obvious articulation of non-one-sidedness is that any real thing exists as what it is, right? And not what it's not. So that's a statement of the meaning of identity, right? If there ever were one, anything is what it is and is not as it's not. However, insofar as this identity is articulated in terms of not just the things existing, but it's existing in a certain way as something and not as something else, any substantial thing is the particular thing it is, partly because of the qualities that it instantiates. But these qualities that anything has are not, as we've been saying, they're not simply static or immutable, although they may have a certain stability rooted in the stability of their substance. So Jains have a further notion of a notion that's closely allied to quality, but more temporally fluxional, what we can call a mode. The sort of the modes of qualities that are in substance. And so any real thing has it is the substance and a quality with its modes, with the modes of these qualities. So, and a thing's modes are inherently diachronic. That is, they're inherently changing with time, right? But in the Jain view, these again go to constitute any real thing as the real thing it is stably over time. You can't have any substance without qualities and modes and vice versa. But since modes are both temporal, changing, and they're qualitative, they constitute a substance in both its numerical identity and its qualitative identity. So this is all especially clear. Again, this has all been very abstract, but let's make it more concrete now. This is especially clear and concrete and pressing in the case of the substance that is a person. That is, when the identity in question is what we call personal identity. So several contemporary philosophers of identity have observed that these disjoint notions of numerical and qualitative identity become unified when we're talking about the identity of persons who have projects that extend through time, values that they intend to live up to, norms that they seek to fulfill, and goals that they hope to reach, right? The Jain, these are things that extend over time. So they require a certain numerical identity, continuation through time. But these are qualities to have certain values and norms and goals. These are qualities of a person, right? And in fact, Jain practice depends on understanding Jain persons in just this way, right? A Jain is supposed to be seeking to liberate themselves. They have the goal of liberating themselves from karmic bondage. They expect that their ethical actions will entail the future rewards upon which their actions are premised, and that by being nonviolent, right, you'll have a better rebirth, and ultimately in the far off horizon, no rebirth. This is what it is to be a person on the Jain path to liberation. This is a path, the Jain path, that it's irreducibly temporal. It presupposes the numerical identity of the person that's traveling it, but to be an identifiable person on such a path is to possess an identifiable qualitative identity, the quality of being Jain, briefly, or in particular, to have these projects of eliminating your karma, and these values of nonviolence, and ultimately for the ultimate goal of being liberated. For a person on the Jain path to liberation, that is, one's numerical identity and their qualitative identity require each other. Personal identity requires both numerical and qualitative identity. Numerical and qualitative require each other. So these contemplations on, the relationship between numerical and qualitative identity have actually taken us beyond the metaphysics of non-one-sidedness into social identity, what it is to be identified as a Jain rather than as an adherent of some other religious community and path. And these metaphysical considerations began at the interfaces between disagreeing philosophers who were seeking common ground, right, in this crucible of religious diversity. And they bring us back to these boundaries. They constitute religious differences at the very same time that they seek to navigate this multiplicity and to settle on basic philosophical truth in the face of disagreement. So that's all I wanted to say about South Asian philosophical debates and how Jain non-one-sidedness, many-sidedness intervenes in it. And I'm sure there's a lot of more that can be said about that and a lot of questions. And I'm not sure how clear any of that was. So let's talk about it now and clear up any questions you might have had.
Yeah, I think we had a couple of questions from the chat. Maybe we start there and then we can open it up. There was a question from Joshua Streeter.
Okay.
I think this was referring back to your presentation on, the self and sort of the denial of the self as an example where there's not mutual agreement. And Joshua asked, so does this mean that the self can never be conscious according to Buddhism?
Yeah. It's a really good question, and this is a really hard question in Buddhism that Buddhist philosophers talk about a lot, because Buddhist philosophers do definitely believe in consciousness. They believe in consciousness. They believe that there is consciousness, and they believe that we are conscious, but they don't, according to sort of Buddhist doctrine, they don't want to say that there is a self that is conscious, that consciousness inheres in a particular self. So actually, one of the earliest Buddhist texts is one of these sutras, these discourses of the Buddha, where there's some monks. There's a monk, one of the Buddhist followers, who says, well, the Buddha's saying that there's consciousness, and the Buddha's saying that there is reincarnation. So there has to be something that's reborn. And what is reborn? It's consciousness. It's what goes from one body to the next, one birth to the next. It's someone's, it's the consciousness that is reborn. That is what you actually are. And that actually sounds very much like the Hindu view that I was saying, right? That what your self is actually conscious. That's who you are, and that's what's reborn. And the Buddha in this teaching, this discourse, he says, "Bring that guy to me." And the monks, his fellow monks, bring him over to the Buddha, and the Buddha says, "When did I ever say that? I never said that, you fool. That is not what I'm teaching. I'm not saying that consciousness reincarnates from one birth to that it's the same consciousness. It's the very same consciousness that goes from one birth to the next." And what the Buddha says is, it's the action of karma that creates certain causes and conditions that create a rebirth and create a causal continuum of consciousness, that consciousness is caused by consciousness, and there is consciousness in the next birth that's caused by consciousness in this birth, but not that there is some self that is persisting across these births, that is some permanent self that is conscious. So that is, it's a very slippery view. And some Buddhist philosophers have said, if you can really understand this, if you can really understand how, karma, works and sets things in motion and how all this really works, then you're enlightened. You're a Buddha. So it's a very slippery view, and don't be worried if it's not totally clear to you. But that's basically, these are the kinds of things that Buddhists say, is that you basically, as I've seen, there's a book title, a contemporary Buddhist book title, that is called Thoughts Without a Thinker. There's consciousness, but there's no self, no person that is conscious. I hope that helps a little bit. It's tricky.
Yeah. We have a couple of questions from Kevin Morrow. I'll field the first one, then the second one. He asks, would Nyaya accept this last contention based on Brahma, X is both X and positively not Y? I don't know if that.
Yeah. Okay, good question. We're getting in the weeds now of Indian philosophy. So Nyaya is another school of Indian philosophy They are basically what we could call Hindu. They do believe in the existence of a self. They do believe that the self is conscious. They are they sort of merge at some point in Indian philosophical history with the Vaisheshikas that I mentioned in my in my presentation. Haribhadra says, you know, the Vaisheshikas say that substance and quality are totally separate, and he says we Jains don't agree with that. And that's basically also a Nyaya view. So Nyaya is this philosophical school that basically merges with these Vaisheshikas, and they have this concept of abhava, which means non-existence. And they believe, and so this is a difficult question. What is the status of abhava in this philosophical school? They do believe that abhava is a sort of real thing, and that to have perceptions of absence is to actually be perceiving an absence that is there. So that is something that the Nyayas believe. Whereas some other schools might say, no, when you have a perception of absence, it's not that you're perceiving a real absence, it's that you are not perceiving a presence or something like that. You know, there's all these different debates, all these different ways of understanding absence. So there seems to be a way in which these Nyaya philosophers can get on board with what Jains are saying, because they seem to take absence seriously as a real thing. I'm not sure, though, that they would, I mean, you do see them saying certain things like, you know, everything is both existent and non-existent, and what it is for something to be existent is to exclude the thing that is, you know, that it is not, exclude the non-existence. But they generally don't go as far as Jains as really saying that you know, everything has both of these properties really at the same time, existence and non-existence. You know, so it's a little, this is, I mean, this is a really good question. That is a question for that you could do some further research on, that I have thought about doing some further research on, is just exactly how far these Nyayikas agree with Jains and how far they don't. A lot of Indian philosophers that seem to be, a lot of Hindu philosophers that seem to be agreeing with the Jains in saying that yes, absences are real. They often want to say that when you perceive an absence, it's because you are thinking about, you know, let's say you say there's not an elephant in the room. So you're not actually perceiving the absence of the elephant in the room. You are perceiving the room, and you are thinking about an elephant, you're remembering an elephant, and you are sort of putting those together and saying that it is not the case that this elephant that I'm thinking about is in the room. So that's how some of them do it. But Jains want to say that you're actually perceiving, you know, no elephant. You're perceiving non-elephant in the room. Okay, so then, yeah, there's the next question I see also from Kevin about a Leibnizian concern regarding dravya, that is substance, being mutually implicative of gunas, that is qualities. If gunas are fleeting, then in some sense, so would dravya be. But dravya, so if qualities are fleeting, then so would substance be fleeting in some way. But substance, dravya, is the stable point around which the gunas flee and adhere, so around which they change, right? So could we say we have an epistemological constraint on understanding dravya through gunas, but not an ontological parity? That's a really good question. Have I understood the Jain position correctly? So I think you have understood the Jain position correctly, that dravya is the stable point around which, substance is a stable point around which qualities adhere and also sort of move and change and flee. And so in some sense, if these dravyas, if these gunas, the qualities are changing and fleeing, then in some sense the substance is too, because they're bound together. So what Jains often say is that there is difference and non-difference between substance and qualities. Substance and qualities are both the same thing, both identical, and not the same thing. And this is, again, an example of non-one-sidedness, of many-sidedness, of this anekāntavāda, this what I call the compossibility of contraries, that, things are both different and non-different from other things. In particular, substance is both different and non-different from qualities. So does that make for an ontological parity? I think it does. But we could debate. I mean, I think there is evidence, and I've tried to present some of that evidence that, like, Haribhadra has said in this slide. I'll go back to that slide. The Jains do not regard, so this is just what I was saying, the Jains do not regard substance and quality as being entirely different. We say they're different in some way. Substance is not partless, but rather has a single multiple nature. It consists of that is to say, it consists of these qualities. Now, is that enough ontological parity? I mean, I think there is evidence. There's other evidence that I haven't presented that there is ontological parity, but this is a deep point that actually requires a lot of kind of exegesis and stuff. So it's a good question. Another good question for further research. Okay, should I go forward?
Yeah, if you want to just keep going down as far as we can, I think. How late can you go till 12:20?
Oh, I'm good now. I had my constraint was on the front end.
Okay. Yeah, I think I have a constraint around 12:30, but otherwise, I don't know if other people have constraints, but
okay.
We can go.
I'll
keep
for a little bit longer. I just stopped sharing my screen because I probably don't need it until I do again, but so we can see each other. So Jacob Bertrand asks, is the act of reincarnation just simply karmatically invoking another consciousness to exist and nothing beyond that? And so I presume we're talking about the Buddhist view, because this is basically sounds like the Buddhist view that reincarnation is karma basically causally producing another consciousness. And yes, I think, I mean, there are definitely, I think, mainstream Buddhist philosophers and these people that are sort of sometimes called Buddhist logicians. This is in the school of Dignaga that I mentioned, his followers, the people who really sort of try to flesh out and have the most influential accounts of metaphysics and logic. They say exactly this, that what's happening, there is no that there is no continuous consciousness. There are simply moments of consciousness and other things. There are moments of existence that each produce the next by causality, karmic and other kinds of causality. And so what you have at one moment is produced by what came at a previous moment, but it's not the same thing. And that's true of reincarnation also, that the later rebirth, it is causally produced by the previous birth, previous incarnation, but it's not that there's some continuous being, some self, that is joining them. And so these Buddhist metaphysicians that I talk about, they subscribe to what is called momentariness, the philosophy of momentariness, that each moment is actually a radically new thing. In every moment, everything is disappearing, and then new things are coming into existence, and that what's joining them is a causal link. Every moment, things are coming into being, causing new things, and then the first things are disappearing, and the new things are coming into being, caused by the previous things. That's basically the philosophy of momentariness, and that is extended, of course, to across lifetimes. That's the Buddhist view. That is not, of course, the Jainism view, the Jain or Hindu views. So Flower says, I'm new to Jainism. Is it a non-religious way of thinking based in Hinduism or an intrinsically Hindu philosophy? So, these questions of these labels and identities these are big historically contested questions about this relationship between Jainism and Hinduism. And so, first of all, I don't think we should call Jainism non-religious, although some people will say Jainism is not a religion, it's an ethics or a way of life. But it really does look like a religion. I mean, I've just talked about the philosophy, some philosophical ideas, but there are whole aspects of institution, community, worship, temples. There are Jain temples, they have divinities that they worship in the temples. So it looks for all the world like a religion, Jainism, and it has a lot of similarities with what are recognizable as Hinduism. They even share some of the same gods, but there are also a lot of differences. And there are certain things, especially like about this aspect of divinity, that Jain doctrine it does not agree with Hindu doctrine on, what are the ultimate divinities, who is ultimately worthy of worship. Jains, basically, the sort of defining feature of a Jain is someone who worships these figures called the Jinnas, which are basically like Buddhas. They are humans that that have liberated themselves. And they say that, there might be these other gods that you hear about in Hinduism, Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva. Okay, they might be there and they might be able to do some things for you, but they're not the ultimate things that you should worship. They're not the ultimate gods that you should worship, because ultimately they're not going to help you with your karma. They're not going to help you to get liberated. That's one basic difference between Jainism and, what you see in a lot of Hinduism is basically, like if you read the Bhagavad Gita or something, it says, pray to me, Vishnu, Krishna, and I will save you. I will worship, I will liberate you. And you will become me. You will become one with me, God, with the universal soul. This is another thing in Jainism, according to Jain doctrine, there is no sort of universal God soul thing, Brahma, as it's sometimes called in Hinduism, that everything is sort of, that unifies everything. In Jainism, you have a whole bunch of infinite, actually, individual souls that have their individual karma, and they're responsible for liberating themselves, getting liberated from their karma. So there's some differences between Jainism and Hinduism. Now, it is also the case that some Jains throughout history and even today will say, yeah, we're basically Hindu, and many Hindus will say, yeah, Jains are basically Hindu. So there are political and social reasons for that, and so I think the best way to really understand this is, again, according to anekāntavāda, Hinduism and Jainism are both different and non-different. And that's true of everything, right? You can always find similarities and commonalities and also differences between any two people, things, groups, societies, anything. So we have to really get clear about what are the differences and what are the commonalities, and what do they share in the ways that I have tried to do. Okay, so next question. Do we have another question? Thank you for
yeah,
your
it's a Zoom user. This is such a big thing.
Thank you all for your attention and for thinking about this. And for I'm glad you find it fascinating. Okay, here's one from Andres Losa. As far as qualitative aspects and the mode is concerned, is the mode the condition or element of change that determines the qualities present, or am I misinterpreting it? I think that's just about right. And this is, again, not as easy a question. It's not as basic a question as it might seem. It's a very fundamental question, but actually, to really understand the relationship between qualities and modes and the substance that they're in, this is actually something that Jain philosophers have kind of talked about in different ways in Jain intellectual history, and that scholars today are still sort of trying to figure out how to talk about this in English. But the way you've said it, that is the mode the condition or element of change that determines the qualities present, I think that's pretty good. That's pretty good. I think I wouldn't say exactly that the modes determine the qualities that are present in the substance. I'd say the qualities are present in the substance, and then the modes kind of determine the way that they're present, or how much they're present, or how they change, right? So let's give an example. Let's take the example a person, a self, and their quality of consciousness again. Okay, same example we've been talking about a lot. If a Jain would say consciousness is actually a fundamental defining quality of the substance that is a self or a soul, a person. And now consciousness sometimes, so okay, I'm a person and I'm conscious by definition, but sometimes I'm asleep, or sometimes my mind is wandering, or sometimes I'm very focused, or sometimes I'm happy, or sometimes I'm sad. These, I think, would all be modes of consciousness. Consciousness being present in sort of more intense and more attenuated degrees, present in different kinds of forms and shapes, maybe. So I think that's maybe how to think about it. Very good question. Thank you for asking it. Okay, and then I see another question from Gabriella Ross. Do you believe what connects the Hindu and Jain community would be their beliefs regarding karma? Or definitely. And in fact, karma, just the basic belief in karma, I think, is something that unites all of the ancient South Asian religions, Jainism, Buddhism, and sort of varieties of Hinduism. And there are also other ones that sort of didn't survive that we haven't heard about, that we don't really hear about, and we don't know much about. All of them agree that karma is real, karma is a thing. But now they all have different, again, they're all similar, they're all different, okay? And so they're all similar in this basic belief in karma, and that karma is kind of what runs things, and determines, how people show up and what happens to people. But they all have somewhat different analyses of just how it works, right? Of how karma works and the role of intention in. But by the way, karma, we're all using the word karma freely because it's sort of entered into English almost. It's like almost an English word, right? Ain't no running from karma. In fact, I was at Universal Studios, or of course, people often say karma's a what. It's the word starting that I'm not going to say. It's a profane word, but I was at Universal Studios a few weeks ago, and I saw there's a little jewelry shop there, I think, called Karma and Luck. They have a hand. If anybody's been to Universal lately in Hollywood, and there's a hand emblem there, and it's called Karma and Luck. So karma is totally part of our normal English now, right? So we haven't been defining it, but I'll tell you the fundamental definition of karma in Sanskrit, it's a Sanskrit word, and the basic meaning of karma in Sanskrit is action. Karma literally just means action, but it has this sense of, as we think of it, right? Action and result, cause and effect, right? Actions that have some consequences. So as you sow, so you reap, to quote the Gospels, right? And so karma, this idea of sort of action and effect, this is shared throughout the ancient South Asian religions. There was one school that they all are always attacking. All the Indian philosophers of all, whether they're Jain, Buddhist, Hindu, they're always attacking the school of materialists who say there's no karma, there's no good and bad karma, there's no, there's just basically atoms hitting against each other, and that's what determines everything, and that's all there is to it. Materialists. And all of the other Indian schools of Indian philosophy and all the religions are always attacking them and saying these guys are boneheads, because all of the other schools of thought believe in karma and believe in good and bad karma and believe in that basically we're somehow in this cycle of rebirth because of karma. But as I say, they have somewhat different analyses. Each of them have somewhat different analyses about that. Just how does karma work? What is it attached to? Is there a soul that karma attaches to? Jains think that. Is it a real thing that we have to deal with and sort of burn off like the Jains think? Or is it just a matter of sort of realizing that you really are your soul? And once you realize that you are not your karma, you are just really your fundamental soul, then it just all disappears and you're liberated. That's what some schools of Hinduism think. Some sort of Vedantic, you may have heard of Vedanta. They sort of seem to think that. And there's some schools of Buddhism that seem to think something like that too. So there are differences between them about how they conceive of karma, how they think it works, and what they think you need to do with it. But they all believe in karma. Okay. Another question: does the subconscious play a role in any of these philosophies? Absolutely. I think where subconscious is probably most fully analyzed is in Buddhism. They have all they're all different uh, analyses in different schools of Buddhism about that we could call subconscious. And these are very often sort of like karmic sort of residues that kind of remain and sort of give rise to our conscious thought. But they're all different ways of cashing this out. Hindu philosophies, the way I think this often comes up in Hinduism, that where they the Upanishads are this very important body of Hindu scripture it's really important for Hindus today and throughout history. And the Upanishads often talk about, how do you know how do you know that consciousness remains? How do you know that the self is conscious, that you are really conscious, and that it doesn't just come in and out of existence like Buddhists say? How do you know that it's something permanent, that it's a permanent aspect of your permanent self? Well, they say, well, you go to sleep and then you wake up again. And when you wake up, you say, oh, I slept well. And that the Upanishads argue that shows that there was some consciousness that was still there in this state of sleep. But it's a subconscious consciousness. If we're calling sleep consciousness, then we have to call it some kind of subconsciousness, probably. So that's one example of how subconsciousness shows up in Hinduism, but there are other examples, and also certainly examples in Jainism, particularly in these complex analyses of the different karmic formations that give rise to different states of consciousness. So there's a few examples of how subconsciousness plays a role in these philosophies. Okay, I don't see any other questions. I see someone else has just entered the waiting room. Okay. Oh, there's one more question has just come. Elizabeth Lesama Conde. Which South Asian countries is Jainism mostly practiced? Yeah. So, yeah, I think I mentioned this briefly maybe before you came in, that it is really Jainism, unlike Buddhism and even unlike Hinduism, Jainism has remained almost completely confined to what is now the nation of India in contemporary times. And it has remained really almost completely confined to the South Asian subcontinent generally. So there were, before the partition of India from Pakistan in 1947, there was a Jain community in Pakistan, and there are still some Jains in Pakistan. There are not many Jains. There are maybe a few Jains in Nepal and Sri Lanka, but not really many. Bangladesh, some. But it really has stayed very large. Jainism seems to have kind of originated in northeast-ish India, in the contemporary Indian state of Bihar, which is also the origination place of Buddhism, where the historical Buddha Siddhartha Gautama Buddha was born and taught, and the sort of Jain founder of our era, Mahavira, Vardhamana Mahavira, is also thought to have lived and taught in that very same area, contemporary with the Buddha, basically. We don't know if they ever met each other, the Jinn and the Buddha, but they may have. Their followers certainly met each other. So that's in sort of northeastern India, the state of Bihar now. And then it spread throughout India. It spread west and south, and disappeared from a lot of these places in India. And the sort of stronghold of Jainism in India is mostly toward the west now, western states, and a little bit in some southwestern states. But this is really where it has stayed mostly confined, except in the Middle Ages, and then now certainly in modernity with globalizing trade. So and Jains have largely been a trading community. It seems like very largely because of their insistence on nonviolence that precludes them from a lot of professions. A lot of industries that, let's say, make weapons, even farming. I won't get into it, but because Jains basically see life everywhere, they don't want to participate in agriculture. So, what the professions that have basically been open to them have been basically trading and financial professions, and these tend to be pretty mobile professions, unlike farming or industry. You travel around and trade with people, and so Jains have moved around along trade routes, and so in the starting about maybe 500 years ago, a big community of Jains developed in East Africa with Indian Ocean trade routes that went across the Arabian Sea, and there are still communities of Jains in East Africa. And then in the colonial period, British colonialism, a lot of Jains ended up in England in the colonial, this colonial center, London especially. And then in today's day, where the U.S. is, the richest and most powerful country that everybody wants to go to, a lot of Jains have come to the U.S. And so there's a Jain community in the U.S., which is why we're having this conversation now, because the Jain community in the U.S. has supported the study and teaching of Jainism. They made possible my professorship here at Santa Barbara, and I think they have endowed this lecture series, as I understand it. So, or some, sponsored some lectures. So that's the Jain community in the U.S. So the Jains have a diaspora, but it's probably a few tens of thousands in the Jain diaspora outside of India, and it's still inside India is certainly less than 10 million. It's always been a small community and still is.
Well, Dr. Mundra, I do have a question, if
Okay,
you don't
great.
mind me. So I come from more of an Aristotelian background, and
Yeah.
I was thinking about your compossibility of contraries.
Yeah.
I see a lot of connection actually with the existential import issues about the teeth of a crow. I was thinking of the goat stag from Aristotle. If you don't have a nature, you really can't have a proposition with a truth value. So some of my logic students will recognize that there's this continuous issue of existential import. I guess I'm wondering, I'm thinking of certain interpretations of Aristotle where maybe substance grounds accidents, and that's where these sort of changes can occur in the accidents, right? And that's where you can have a substance have these contrary changes. It's sort of fascinating to me that this is something Plato's picking up on and Aristotle's picking up on,
Yeah.
trying to account for change, trying to account for unity and
Yes.
plurality. So I guess what would you say is the major difference between, say, an Aristotelian account and a Jainist account?
Yeah, it's a great question. I am not enough of an expert in Aristotle to really do justice to that question. I think one of the main differences that I pointed to is what I pointed to in my lecture, is that it seems to me that in the metaphysics, at least, Aristotle says that substance is primary, and qualities and accidents really only have a secondary reality. That's sort of parasitic on the reality of substance. Now, I don't know. I mean, that it really, you can correct me if I'm wrong about that. I think it seems to me that would probably, there's probably some good exegesis on Aristotle, and how, because I've just looked at sort of, I'm just talking about one spot in the metaphysics where he says this, and there's probably a whole lot more one could look at in Aristotle to really nuance this picture. But that seems to me a kind of, at least whether or not Aristotle actually thought that, seems to me a kind of an Aristotelian kind of vein in Western metaphysics that tends to, at least in some ways, bifurcate substance and qualities / accidents, and make substance really primary. Now, so it seems to me that that's a difference, but I'm not sure. But I think that in a lot of ways, now another difference I want to point to from about what you just said about logic and existential import. So I have argued, and I think it's really important that Jains, that this compossibility of contraries thing does not violate the Aristotelian principle of non-contradiction. That all these different ways that Aristotle phrases non-contradiction, that these actually are fully in compliance with those. And it's because Aristotle always has this clause that things cannot have the same property in the same respect. He always says this. It's not that cannot have contradictory properties in the same respect. He so Aristotle so that's the clause. That's the sort of the qualification I think that Jains escape through, right? Because they want to say that contraries are compossible in different respects, not in the same respect. And so I think Jains comply with the Aristotelian law of non-contradiction. However, I think they don't. I'm not sure about this, but I think Aristotle again. He seems to he's also I think it's a little bit, to me at least, and I think there's a scholarly debate about this, about where Aristotle stands on things like chimera, the goat stag, or things that haven't happened yet, right? So whether there are things, whether there's sort of a where the middle stands, where there's a third option between true and false and this kind of stuff. And the Jains don't really talk about that, and I think they want to say everything is both true. So I think Jains would say about a goat stag, it both exists as a goat and does not exist as a goat. It both exists as a stag and does not exist as a stag. It both exists as a it exists as a sort of constructed fictional entity, but does not exist as a real thing. So in fact, there's an Indian analog of this, which is the man lion, and this is a mythological Indian creature that comes in Hindu mythology, the man lion. And Jains actually used this as an example of non-one-sidedness, as an example of the compossibility of contraries. That we can think of things that combine contrary, like man and lion, goat and stag, let's say. We can think of things that combine contraries coherently. We just have to understand what we're talking about there.
Thank you very much. Yeah. And I think Flower did have a follow-up.
Flower, yeah. Is the reason that Jainism doesn't violate the non-contradictory arguments because Jainism states that opposing ideas are dependent on each other rather than in complete contradiction. That's a nice way of putting it. And the way I would put it is that opposing ideas, or rather opposing properties, are complementary to each other. So they're dependent on each other in that sense, that they do exclude each other, but they exclude each other in a complementary way. I actually think the yin yang, everyone knows the yin yang, which is a Taoist symbol, it's not a Jain symbol, but I actually think that this is a great image for that. And in the yin and the yang, yin and yang, are complementary. They're different, but they're complementary and sort of dependent on each other in some way, as you say. They're intertwined, as you can see in the picture of the yin yang, they're sort of intertwining, and they have some of each other in the other one, So, but they always come together. They require each other. They mutually imply each other. So they're complementary, rather than in complete contradiction, as you say. They don't completely exclude each other. And the Jains say exactly that although contrary properties exclude each other, although they are sort of conceptually mutually exclusive, they don't exclude each other from being in the same thing because they're intertwined. So that's the best I can. It's a kind of a difficult doctrine to really get, but it's actually really easy to really get if you really get it. And it sounds like Flower gets it. So thank you, Flower. That was a great. And I see that Joshua also asked could it be, or has it been argued that the recognition of a subconscious is in itself a recognition of the self? And yes, exactly. This is one of the big arguments amongst Hindus, of one of the big proofs that Hindus give for the existence of the self, that it's because there's this subconscious that you see like in, across sleep and waking states. That's how you know that there's a self. And then when later Buddhists start to systematize and theorize the subconscious, that there's this subconscious substratum underlying these conscious states and stuff, then a lot of Hindus and even some other Buddhists come back to them and say, you guys are just saying that there's a self. This is just a self by another name. You Buddhists always said that there's no self or whatever, but now you've come back with this other thing that is basically the self we were talking about, and that's the self by another name. So now, of course, these Buddhists that theorize the subconscious in this way, they have responses to that, and they don't want to say that they're just coming back with another self. So this is a whole big argument that you've put your finger on that goes throughout 2,500 years of Indian thought. Thank you for bringing that up.
I've got another question that someone sent just to me. It says, hello, Professor. I wanted to ask about the ideas of nonviolence in Jainism.
Oh, yes.
And how it differs in application from other South Asian religions, specifically for the non-monks in the community.
Okay, yeah. So a whole big other can of worms. Nonviolence is absolutely central to Jainism, and in fact, I've just this class that I just came running from out of breath was the first session of my nonviolence seminar, in which we start with Jainism because it's so important in Jainism. But it's also super important in other Indian religions, other South Asian religions, in Hinduism and Buddhism, and they all have some version. They all talk about nonviolence, ahimsa, and they all have some version of saying, nonviolence is like the highest dharma, the highest kind of law. So there's various ways we could ask this. We could look at this question in a historical way. Some people have argued historically that Jainism sort of came up with nonviolence, and the other ones kind of got it from them, inherited it from them. It's really hard to know. I think one thing we can say is that nonviolence is part of a general renunciant religious tendency that both Jainism and Buddhism shared in. They both sort of came up as renunciant religions 2,500 or so years ago. And so they both have these orientations towards nonviolence, towards sort of renouncing violence, along with other things, renouncing sort of action that interferes in the world, right? In order to sort of transcend the world. And then you have also renunciant tendencies in Hinduism, in the Upanishads. And so there's this whole renunciant movement. It is quite in contrast to what is also considered Hindu, which is original Vedic, the oldest Vedic religion of ritual sacrifice and so on, in which there is discussion of animal sacrifice. And then later Hindu philosophers talk a lot about, doing sacrifice, is this violent, or does this contravene nonviolence? And then because nonviolence became a part of Hinduism, a lot of Hindu philosophers, have arguments for why sacrificing things and, even animal sacrifice is not actually violent. And so so you see there that it becomes a part of all of these religions, but, Jainism always is is constantly sort of having these polemics, mounting these diatribes against like animal sacrifice, and they always point fingers at Hindu Brahmins, saying you guys do sacrifices, animal sacrifice, and it's violent and that's bad. And so you have all of these it's very much part of the pan-Indian religious conversation, but sort of again, like with all the things I'm talking about, it takes kind of different forms and has a different place, slightly different places in all these different traditions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mundra. We greatly appreciate this. And I also want to say to our guests. All these students have asked wonderful questions.
Yeah.
Just very happy.
Yeah, thank you all so much. These have been fantastic questions. These are some of the best questions I've gotten, after I've given a talk. So thank you all so much for your outstanding engagement. Super impressed. I would love to talk to you all more.
And in that vein, I did want to let everyone know that we will have another series or another event on this series of Jainism on April 24th at 11 a.m. on the same link with Dr. Chris Rawls on the nonviolent aspects of Jainism and whether it entails some sort of pluralism. So if you're interested in that, please come back for that presentation.
That'll be great. I'd like to come back for that.
Yeah, please do. Please do.
Yeah. Great.
All right. I guess on that note, we can say goodbye and thank you again.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.